Hello, my name is Shawn Conley, and this is part 3 of our soybean growth and development and management slide series. Today we will be discussing in this section reproductive stages in development. This is a simple schematic of the growth stages or the reproductive growth stages we'll be discussing, anywhere from R1, which is beginning bloom or first flower, all the way up through R8, which is physiological plant maturity. To give you all a sense of the soybean reproductive development, gives across how this in the number of days it takes. In a sense, we can see where they have the flowering versus vegetative growth versus pod development and seed filling. Really gives growers a sense of how long that soybean plant is actually out there trying to produce seed, which differs much more so than field corn. We have a much limited window in order to be able to maximize yield. In this situation, you can see that soybean plant is filling for as much as 35 to 40 days on an average growing season. Obviously, if we see a reduction in the seed filling time frame, that we'll see a much smaller seed size and decreased yield. On the opposite, if we see a much longer seed filling period, we can tend to see a much larger soybean seeds as well as increased soybean yield. So being able to go out and assess the beginning flower, which is R1 growth stage, is when you can find one open flower at a specific node. And here's an example right here. It's probably difficult for the growers or the consultants to see, but here's a better example. You can see where that flower begins, and it's usually somewhere in that second to third node above the unifoliates is where we can identify where that first open flower is. So realistically, to call a soybean field R1, and from this point forward, it's when 50% of the plants, of all the plants in that field, have that same growth stage. So again, if 50% of the plants have one open flower, that's when you would identify that field as being at the R1 growth stage. One of the management considerations we need to be looking forward to in the reproductive growth stages, list anything from our soybean diseases, from white mold to sun death, some of the late season weeds, insect control such as soybean aphid, as well as some of the harvest timing and storage questions, and finally identity preserve or IP questions. So again, these are some of the topics we'll be discussing throughout this final session. Some of the common diseases we see in soybean are primarily white mold, brown stem rot or SDS, Phytophthora root rot, bacterial blights, some of the viruses we see, soybean mosaic virus, bean pod, as well as SCN. We'll touch on a few of the major one of these topics as we move forward. However, I know Damon Smith has already done a soybean disease development guideline, so I'd encourage growers and crop consultants to go back and look at Damon's set of CCA slides regarding common diseases of soybean. The major one that we tend to see across Wisconsin on an annual basis is white mold or Sclerotinia sclerotia. It has a very broad base range and it has many structures. And here is basically the sclerotia, and above this are the apothecia, which actually emit the spores that cause that infection. The timing of this is anywhere from that early reproductive growth stage, so R1, R2 into R3 is that framework when we need to be managing and controlling and looking for this pest complex. The second pest complex to really be identifying at this R1 growth stage is the soybean cyst nematode. This can be easily identified at this time of season under drought stress conditions where we see the canopy here really isn't closing. It's having a difficult time. However, honestly, the most prevalent sign of SCN, there's no symptoms at all. So that's where we need to go out and spend some time sampling, which will be discussed shortly. But to give you all a scale of scope of how large SCN is, these white cysts on this root next to my finger kind of show us that this is the pest that we're combating, and this is what we're going to be looking for and identifying when we're out scouting at this R1 growth stage. So one of the things that we have in Wisconsin is the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board has been sponsoring SCN testing program for over 20 years. And what this program does is it allows growers from across the state of Wisconsin to submit up to 4 free samples on an annual basis in order to get in and get a free SCN sampling kit or testing done. So in 2014, we have submitted up to 1,400 sample kits were sent out, and as of December 1st, 650 of those samples came in. If you look here, this is kind of a graph of the number of percentage of finds in 14. Again, on average, about 25% of the fields, about 1 in 4, test positive for SCN. So this gives you a sense of how prevalent this pathogen is across Wisconsin. Here, this picture in red, this gives us a sense of all of the counties across the primary soybean production states that have already identified soybean cyst nematode. So again, it's a very ubiquitous pathogen across the United States, and even though it is present in Wisconsin, about 25% of our fields only have this issue. So again, I encourage growers to go out, take advantage of this SCN testing program sponsored by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. Here is a guide that you can download from the North Central Soybean Research Board on SCN management. It kind of gives us some key recommendations. Most of those come down to rotate to non-host crops, rotate with resistant varieties, as well as really understand what is the cropping system that you have employed across all of your fields, specifically those that have SCN, in order to really mitigate this problem. Because SCN is one of those issues that once you have SCN, you'll be dealing with it for the life of that field, however long you have it in your production system. So just make sure you work accordingly to mitigate it through crop rotation and utilizing SCN resistant varieties. In summary, I again briefly just talked about diseases, but I want to encourage everyone to go to Damon Smith's Plant Disease Information webpage, which is the Wisconsin Field Crops Pathology page right here, and it's listed below. And again, please go through and look at Damon Smith's CCA recommendations based on disease management in this series. The next growth stage we really want to address is this R2 growth stage. This is when we have an open flower at one of the two uppermost nodes. The most specific timing is here. This is when the label for glyphosate basically indicates to all growers they should stop spraying glyphosate. So up from VE all the way up to this R2 growth stage, which is usually a 6-week, 8-week window, gives us growers an application timing to apply glyphosate or Roundup. But once we hit this timing, any application post R2 is deemed off-label, and therefore growers should not be applying glyphosate at that timing. The next growth stage we're going to be addressing is R3, which is this beginning pod stage. This is when you have a pod about 3/16 of an inch long, and it's at one of the 4 uppermost nodes. Generally, what we can see is about 60 to 75% of some of these pods will abort throughout the growing season. But again, that just kind of gives you a sense with the plasticity of that soybean crop and why we tend to flower for several weeks over the growing season in order to really take advantages of favorable weather in order to set the best pod development in order to maximize yield for that soybean growth and development. The next growth stage is R4. This is when the pod is 3/4 of an inch long at one of the 4 uppermost nodes. This is where we really begin to see some issues related to yield decline if we start seeing crop injury from this point forward. Again, this is on the flip side, this is when we really see the yield increasing in terms of we really start to set seeds and start moving into the beginning seed growth stage, which is R5. This is when if you split a pod open, seed is about 1/8 of an inch long in a pod in one of those 4 uppermost nodes. There's a large demand for water and nutrients at this R5 growth stage, and this is really a time when you start to maximize height and leaf area is at this R5 growth stage. This kind of gives us a sense of seed and pod development through the R5 growth stage. Again, if you're going to and identify, this would be the beginning of R5. This would be characteristic as R5.5 growth stage. So if you're out there looking at the pods and splitting them, it's because that seed is taking about 50% of that seed pod cavity. And then we move into this next growth stage where we see that bean has completely filled that soybean canopy, and that would be the R6 growth stage. Now, from this point forward, we can really start seeing some significant damages from environmental characteristics, specifically hail damage. We see many areas across the United States where hail damage can be very devastating to a soybean crop. Many growers, given today's commodity prices and the risk, have hail insurance or other forms of crop insurance. This is the best time to really encourage growers that if they do have hail insurance, to have their adjuster come out before they make any crop management decisions. Because if they make a decision before the crop adjuster comes out or the hail adjuster comes out, then they're basically mute, and their policy can be tossed away because they've gone against the policy recommendations. This slide gives us a good idea of what type of yield loss we can see from hail damage based on the crop growth stage, as well as on how much leaf defoliation has occurred. Across the x-axis here, we'll see the crop growth stage where defoliation occurred. On the y-axis, we can get an estimate of what the percent yield loss is. If we go by these different lines, the blue line is 50% defoliation, the red line is 75% defoliation, and the yellow line would be a 100% defoliation. So at V4 crop growth stage, a soybean plant can get up to almost 100% defoliation and still be less than 20% yield loss. Again, that crop is going to take a yield loss hit, but it's not as substantial as you would believe. Once we get into the R2 and R5 growth stage, again, a soybean plant can handle 50 to 75% defoliation and still be within that 20% yield loss. However, once that plant hits that R2 growth stage and beyond, and we have 100% defoliation due to hail damage, stripping out all of the stems of their leaves, at that point we can have up to 60% yield loss. So again, gives you a sense of the damage potential of that hail injury by crop growth stage and by the amount of defoliation that occurs. The next growth stage we're going to discuss is R6, which is a full seed. This is when the pod contains a green cavity that fills one of the pods at one of the four uppermost nodes. The next crop growth stage we move into would be the R7 growth stage, which would be classified as beginning maturity. This is where one pod anywhere on that stem has a mature color, which would be a tawny brown color. So it gives us a sense of physiological plant maturity. Last one is full maturity. This is when 95% of the pods have reached their mature color. This would give us an indication that that soybean plant is harvestable within 7 to 10 days after R8. And plant populations at this time can be assessed to really make sure that we are above that 100,000 plants per acre threshold for most Wisconsin soils in order to maximize soybean yield. In terms of some of the harvesting and post-storage considerations for soybean, again, in terms of managing moisture, 13% moisture is optimal for both storage and sale of your soybean crop. Just make sure you carefully adjust and continue to readjust your combine, because header losses can account for up to 80% of harvest losses in the field. And it's very difficult or challenging to go through there and complete the harvest process and go back and count the number of beans that have been lost due to header or combine losses and see how many bushels you've left in the field. And again, make sure to run that header as low as possible, specifically if you do have lower plant populations, because those soybean pods tend to rest lower on those stems. We see more of them getting close to that soil surface, and we want to capture as many of those as possible in order to maximize our soybean yield across that field. In order to maximize yield, we really have to understand what are the seed yield determining factors. In general, what we're trying to do is maximize the number of seeds per unit area. Okay, this is driven by how many plants you have across that unit area, say per acre. Again, our base for 90%, 80 to 90% of all Wisconsin soils is 100,000 plants per unit area. By driving our soybeans earlier, we can increase the number of nodes per plant, which then often leads to increased pods per unit node, or number of pods per plant. The final characteristics of seeds per pod is it's very difficult to manage with our normal management characteristics. This is primarily very highly genetics driven, seeds per pod, and normally the only opportunity that we have to affect seeds per pod is in a drought situation where we tend to see some seed abortion. So again, we really want to focus on what can we do to increase the number of seeds per unit area. That is the primary driver of soybean yield, not just in Wisconsin, but across the world. The last characteristic that comes into play is seed weight. And again, much of that is driven by how long that soybean plant remains in that R6 or seed fill period. Once we finally completed harvesting, we really want to do a couple things. Finally go out and do a last check on stand assessment, make sure we've hit our threshold of 100,000 plants per acre. We want to be able to go out and do some soil tests to really get an idea of what our soil fertility levels are, so we can get our fertility program set. Next, go through and evaluate our yields, either using yield monitors or check strips, really get a good sense of how well our soybeans yields performed across all of our fields. And lastly, go through and look at variety test results, like the Wisconsin Soybean Variety Test Program, for example, to get a sense of how your variety performed against competitors, and to help make decisions for seed placement for the following growing season. I'd like to end this with kind of talking about what are the keys to success for soybean production in Wisconsin. Okay, number one, I really want to encourage growers to fertilize in line based on a sound soil testing program. Two, please do not till or plant when soils are too wet. We often hear of growers talking about sidewall compaction in corn. We can see it just as readily on soybean and have issues with germination emergence and some issues with the stem breaking. Third, plant on dates recommended for your area. Again, look at that early planting dates if you can get across those fields in order to maximize soybean yield. Number four, select those varieties best suited for your area. Again, please feel free to use the Wisconsin Soybean Variety Test Program book, as well as other company sales brochures as well, to get a good sense of how well these varieties perform over a wide range of areas. Use seed treatments and inoculate those seeds as necessary. Use a proper plant population for your row spacing. Do not plant deeper than an inch. Guess when you're starting to target that soybean seeding at 1 inch optimum. Lastly, through the growing season, please monitor and control pest populations as necessary, and harvest carefully and in a timely manner in order to reap all of the rewards that you've been able to accumulate through a long, grueling production system. So with that, I'd like to encourage everyone to go to my website, which is coolbean.info, follow me on Twitter, or go to my soyreport.blogspot.com, or contact your local county extension agent for any other questions you may have regarding soybean production and management.